Have you ever had a woman tell you she felt safe with you, only to later accuse you of smothering her? Have you ever poured your heart into building something real, only to watch her walk away without warning? Not because you lied, not because you betrayed her, but because you loved her too well. She said I made her feel seen. She said I was the calm in her storm. She said she'd never had anyone stay, and then one night, she said she couldn't breathe. She packed her bags while I stood there, still holding space for her pain, like I always had, and before the front door closed behind her, she looked at me with a kind of sorrow I still don't understand, and said, "You're a good man, but I can't do this anymore." How do you make sense of that? How do you reconcile being the safest place she's ever known with being the reason she ran? Why do some women destroy the very men who loved them the most? I'm not a therapist. I'm not some self-help guru in a suit. I'm just a man who thought he understood women until I turned 54 and found myself completely undone by one. See, I'd been married for 28 years. I thought I knew the rules: provide, protect, stay, don't. Raise your voice, don't walk away, be strong, be calm, be there. So I was, even after the divorce, even after starting over. And then I met her. She was different, wounded. Yes, but real. There was a kind of beauty in her sadness that made me want to hold it, to fix it, to show her that not every man leaves. And for a while, it worked. She opened up. She cried in my arms. She said things like, "I feel like I can finally breathe around you." But over time, something shifted. The same arms that once felt like home suddenly made her restless. The same presence that once grounded her began to feel too much. She started pulling away after moments of closeness. She flinched at affection. She questioned my intentions when all I offered was consistency. At first, I thought I was doing something wrong. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I was too available. But the truth was deeper than that, and far more painful. Some women, especially those who've lived through chaos, don't trust peace. They mistake stability for control. They associate gentleness with manipulation. They don't believe love can come without a cost, because in their past, it always did. And if you're a man over 50, there's a real chance you've attracted this kind of woman, not because you're weak, but because you're safe. And in her world, safe feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels dangerous. So she runs, and you're left with a question no one prepares men like us to ask. Was I really the problem, or just the mirror? This isn't just about heartbreak. This is about the collision of two unconscious stories. Hers, written in survival, and yours, written in silence. Because if you're like me, you were taught how to stay, but you were never taught what to do when someone pushes you away for doing exactly that. So if you've ever been left confused, gutted, and grieving for something you thought was finally real, stay with me. Because this isn't just your story. It's the story of many good men. And today, through the lens of Carl Jung's psychology, and with a little help from the emotional insights of John Gottman, we're going to look at what really happens when your love becomes the trigger, and why her leaving might say more about her unconscious pain than it ever said about your worth. Let's begin with Frank, a man who did everything right, and still ended up holding the silence she left behind. Frank was 62 when the silence finally swallowed him. Retired firefighter, 2 grown sons, divorced once, amicably, as he'd say. He lived in a modest house outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just neat, quiet, predictable. That's who Frank was. Predictable, the kind of man who checks the locks every night, who never forgets your birthday, who always fills your gas tank before you notice it's low. He met her at a bookstore, of all places. She was flipping through a copy of The Bell Jar, her fingers tracing the lines like they might open something hidden. Frank, being Frank, simply said, "That book's heavier than it looks." She laughed, and that laugh, God, he'd say, it had history in it, like something trying to remember joy. Her name was Claire. She was 52, recently single, soft-spoken, sharp-witted, emotionally complex. She loved poetry, jazz, and quiet men with steady hands. I've had enough chaos in my life, she told him over wine on their third date. I just want peace now. Frank believed her. He showed up fully. No games. No mystery, no seduction tactics, just presence. He listened without trying to solve. He held her through anxiety attacks, sat with her through silences. He learned the names of her favorite authors and the story behind each tattoo she'd carefully hidden. She cried in his arms one night and said, "I didn't think men like you existed anymore." Frank didn't say anything. He just kissed her forehead and stayed. And for 6 months things were good. Not perfect. Claire had her moods. She'd get distant without warning. But Frank didn't mind. He knew how to wait out a storm. Then something changed. It started small. She began pulling away after moments of closeness. She stopped responding to his texts with warmth. She went cold after nights of deep intimacy. When he asked if something was wrong, she shrugged. "I don't know. I just feel heavy." He gave her space. Then came the sharpness. She accused him of trying to fix her, of watching her too closely, of making her feel too seen. Frank, bewildered, asked, "Isn't that what you wanted? For someone to see you finally?" Claire looked at him, eyes full of tears and fear, and whispered, "It's too much. You're too much." And just like that, she was gone. No dramatic goodbye, no betrayal, no other man. Just absence, a love that once curled around his ribs like comfort, now sat inside him like a ghost that refused to leave. Frank told me all this the way older men often tell the stories that broke them, calmly, quietly, like they're remembering a fire that burned years ago, but whose smoke they can still smell. He said, "I didn't raise my voice. I never walked out. I tried to give her peace, and still, she left." What do you do when even your calm feels threatening to someone? What do you say to a man like Frank? What do you say when his love wasn't lacking, but was too present? For someone who only knew love as absence, because Claire didn't leave Frank out of cruelty. She left him because being loved, that completely made her confront something she wasn't ready to face. And Frank became the mirror she shattered to. Avoid seeing herself. I used to think that when love failed, it was because someone didn't try hard enough. Now I understand, sometimes love fails because it touches something the other person hasn't yet dared to feel. That's what happened with Claire. And it wasn't just about her, or Frank, or their history. It was about the part of her that had never felt truly safe, and the terrifying unfamiliarity of finally being loved in a way that required no performance. John Gottman, one of the most respected relationship researchers in the world, described this pattern as emotional flooding. When someone, especially someone with a history of relational trauma, senses intense intimacy, the body interprets it as threat, not safety, even if logically it knows this is good. The nervous system screams, "Get out." And so Claire ran, not from danger, but from the part of herself that didn't know how to receive peace without sabotaging it. Frank wasn't too much. He was the mirror, the calm presence that exposed the storm still alive inside her. Now, here's where Carl Jung enters the room, quietly, like he always does. Jung believed we all carry within us a shadow, the parts of ourselves we've repressed, denied, buried, the fears we never voiced, the rage we tucked away, the pain we never gave language. When that shadow goes unexamined, we don't get rid of it. We project it. We cast it outward, usually onto the people closest to us, the ones we say we love. Claire projected her fear of control onto Frank. Not because he was controlling, but because being seen, being held, and being stayed with felt like a violation to the part of her that only knew love as abandonment or performance. Frank's consistency, threatened the entire emotional architecture she'd built to survive. Because if he really saw her, if he really stayed, if he really loved the part of her she hated, then what excuse did she have left to keep hiding? Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And sometimes that includes destroying the one person who simply loved them as they are. I've seen it over and over again. Men over 50 finally showing up with emotional clarity and steadiness, and being left by women who said that's exactly what they wanted, until it actually arrived. Why? Because in the absence of chaos, many people feel disoriented. They don't trust stillness. Stillness feels like a setup, like the quiet before something breaks. So they break it first. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Claire didn't leave because Frank failed her. She left because Frank held up a mirror she didn't want to look into. And when your unconscious sees a mirror too clearly, it reacts like a frightened child waking from a nightmare. It lashes out, it runs, it shuts down. But here's the tragedy. The mirror never meant harm. It simply reflected what was already there. After Claire left, Frank told me something I'll never forget. He said, if I had just loved her better, maybe she would have stayed. That sentence, soft, quiet, defeated, hit me like a punch to the chest, because I've said it too. And maybe you have. If I had been more patient, if I hadn't asked so many questions, if I had just held the pain without reacting to it. But let me say this as clearly as I can, brother. You can't love someone out of their unhealed past, no matter how steady your hands, no matter how open your heart, no matter how long you're willing to stay. Love doesn't override trauma. Presence doesn't undo unconscious beliefs, and consistency alone does not repair a nervous system wired for survival. You can hold her story, you can walk beside her healing, but you cannot be the one who does it for her. There is a dangerous myth many good men carry, especially after 50, that if we just give enough, hold enough, fix enough, we can heal her pain, make her stay, make her trust, make her believe that this time it's safe. We become emotional contortionists, bending ourselves in every direction to prove we're not like the others. But what we don't realize is, we're not loving her anymore. We're performing for the wounded child in her, performing for the savior in us. This is what Jung would call unconscious compensation. When we over-identify with one role, the good man, the fixer, the calm one, to avoid feeling something deeper in ourselves, we stop being partners and become providers of emotional safety at the cost of our own wholeness. Frank didn't realize he was disappearing. He thought he was showing up. But with every unspoken resentment, with every apology for simply having needs, with every moment he stayed silent to avoid triggering her fears, he was slowly erasing his own reflection from the relationship. And here's the thing. No one tells. Men like Frank, and maybe no one ever told you, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a woman is to stop trying to rescue her. Because the moment you become her rescuer, you stop being her equal, and she will either grow dependent on you or resent you for making her feel weak. That's the paradox. The more you try to protect her from her wounds, the more she will unconsciously resist your love, because it threatens the identity she built to survive. Claire didn't need Frank to be stronger. She needed him to stop carrying a weight that was never his to lift, and Frank, like many of us, had to learn that being good doesn't mean being selfless to the point of self-erasure. We are not here to save women from themselves. We are here to meet them with boundaries, presence and truth. And if they can't meet us there, no matter how deeply we care, we must have the courage to walk away without making it a story about our failure. Because sometimes loving harder isn't love at all. It's fear wearing a mask. There's a moment after the heartbreak when the pain starts to settle like dust, and you're left alone with the question, was I trying to love her or trying to redeem myself? That's where I found myself, not just grieving the loss of, but realizing how much of me I had handed over in the process. See, when two people fall in love, it's rarely just the present that shows up. The past arrives too, quietly, invisibly, and if we're not conscious, we start reenacting old stories. Hers was a story of survival, of love as control, of comfort as conditional. Mine was the story of the man who stays, the one who never raises his voice, the one who tries to be so safe, so calming, so generous, that no one could ever accuse him of being the source of pain. But that's not love. That's atonement. That's trying to earn what should be given freely. Carl Jung called this the collision between the shadow and the persona. The persona is who we become to be accepted, the man who's always reliable, who never complains, who absorbs instead of explodes. The shadow is what we repress in the process, the anger we never voiced, the needs we minimized, the fear of being abandoned for being too much. And when that shadow is ignored, it doesn't go away. It shows up in our relationships. We become attracted to women whose chaos calls out our longing to fix. We feel responsible for their peace. We stay longer than we should, not because we're strong, but because leaving would mean facing the truth that we're still afraid to be unloved. This is the unconscious dance. Her fear of being controlled meets your fear of being left. Her pattern, push away anyone who gets too close. Your pattern, prove you're worthy by never leaving. So you stay, you shrink, you soothe, you sacrifice. And she pulls away harder, until one day, she's gone. Jung warned of this exact dynamic when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Claire wasn't just reacting to Frank. She was reacting to every man before him, to every moment she'd had to pretend, to every time her vulnerability was used against her. And Frank wasn't just reacting to Claire. He was trying to rewrite a story written decades ago, where emotional presence was rewarded, not punished. They weren't loving each other. They were reenacting their wounds, and that's the part most people never see. Sometimes the love that breaks you isn't your greatest failure. It's your clearest mirror, because when you realize this, truly see it, something shifts. You stop asking, "Why did she leave me?" And you start asking, "What part of me was drawn to someone who could not stay? What part of me still believed I had to be less, to be loved?" And that, my friend, is the beginning of real healing, not through her return, not through a new woman, but through the reclamation of the man you buried just to be chosen. There's a silence that follows heartbreak, not the loud, shattering kind, but the slow, echoing stillness that lingers when a woman you loved is no longer there. Frank told me he still listens for her footsteps, not because he wants her back, but because part of him still hopes to hear an apology that may never come. I know that sound, I've waited for it too, but here's what I've learned. Her leaving wasn't a verdict on your worth. It wasn't proof that you were too intense, too emotional, too kind, too stable. It was just the end of a pattern, and the beginning of something far more honest, because once she's gone, and the storm settles, and the ache stops screaming, you're left with the man who stayed. You, not the performer, not the rescuer, not the fixer, the one who felt it all, the one who showed up anyway. And if you can sit in that space, without numbing it, without rushing, to fill it with someone new, you start to see what Jung called the individuation path. The process of becoming whole, no longer just a provider, no longer just the good guy, no longer just the background character in someone else's emotional drama, but a man with boundaries, a man who knows when to stay. And when staying becomes self-betrayal, because the point of heartbreak isn't to make you smaller, it's to bring you back to yourself, to the parts of you you abandoned in the name of being chosen. And when you do come back, fully, consciously, something beautiful happens. You stop needing to be the man who saves her, and you become the man who sees her, only if she's ready to be seen. And if she's not, you let her go, not from bitterness, but from clarity. I love you, but I won't disappear to keep you here. That's what real presence sounds like. That's what conscious masculinity looks like. It's not stoic detachment. It's not wounded overgiving. It's truth rooted in wholeness. So if you've ever felt like you were punished for showing up, if you've ever been left for being too calm, too kind, too aware, you weren't too much. You were finally real, and some people, they're not ready for that kind of mirror. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been loved for the idea of who you were but rejected when you started showing up fully? Have you ever loved so deeply that it broke something in her? If yes, then you're not alone, and you don't need to carry that story in silence anymore. Comment below, I showed up fully. If you've ever felt this kind of heartbreak, your story might be the one another man needs to see, because healing doesn't begin when she comes back. It begins when you return to yourself.